2025 sees the birth of Generation Beta. On the back of the maturing Gen Alpha and Gen Z generations, they are going to fundamentally change consumer expectations for every brand and business. Are we ready? Well, let's find out. Hi there, my name is Ken Hughes. Welcome back. So this year sees the birth of Generation Beta. This is the first time we have ever had 7 consumer generations in the world at the same time. 7 different generations that you as a brand or business now have to cope with in terms of meeting their value sets, understanding their perceptions, because obviously every generation does have different value sets, different things that influence that generation growing up, politically, economically, technologically, socially. So they joined this whole string. Let's start at the beginning so we understand where we are and where we've come from. So the traditionalists were born from 1928 to 1945, born into the Great Depression, into World War II. It was a very manual generation. They saw the birth of automation, the beginning of things. By 1949, 50% of US households had a refrigerator, for instance, which meant that half of them didn't. My own father was born in this generation. He remembers his mother getting an automated washing machine for the first time. And so these were a generation that were quite simple, quite manual. And then they gave way to the baby boomer generation. They were born from 1946 to 1964. They were the generation that had the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, so very political, but also saw huge economic prosperity. It was a TV for all, automobiles for all. It was the beginning of automation, but it was quite, again, an analog world. It was the rotary phone, it was vinyl, so everything was kind of still manual, but analog. It was the beginning of low tech. And then that gave way, of course, to Generation X. They were born from 1965 to 1979. And they were what we call a very low-tech generation, but again, more than boomers. So we had our MTV culture. It was the Watergate scandal. And it was a world of CD Walkman and Sony Walkmans. It was a world of joysticks and Pac-Man and video game consoles and Atari. And it was the beginning of the electronic age. And then that gave way to the Gen Y, or millennial generation, born 1980 to 1994. They were known as the white wire generation because Steve Jobs gave them the iPod, the iPhone, and suddenly everything went digital. So they were the first generation that went from analog to digital, and they grew up in a post 9/11 world, a world of the internet, birth of AOL and the internet. So that gave way then to Gen Z, and Gen Z were born from 1995 until 2010. And they were our generation that were first digital native generation. They were born into this digital reality. And they were born into a world of apps and a world of Spotify instead of iPhone. They were born into a world of Snapchat and TikTok. And so it was all very app-based for them. They grew up in a world of social media, which is kind of coming up for the first time. And then that gave way to Gen Alpha, our most latest recent generation. They are growing up in a world of streaming. They're the streaming generation, the AR, the VR, early AI assistants like Alexa and Siri. They grew up in a world of general geo and political unrest recently. Also, they were the generation that faced the global health pandemic. And then we have Generation Beta arriving now. What will the world hold for Generation Beta? Who will they be? What kind of society, what kind of brands, e-commerce are we going to drift into with Generation Beta? Well, the one thing we can guarantee, and I don't have a crystal ball, so nobody knows. If they do try and tell you, they don't know what they're talking about. But ultimately, the one thing we can be guaranteed is things are going to get faster and things are going to get better in terms of tech and what we can do in our capabilities. And that's because Gordon Moore, who was one of the co-founders of Intel, had this wonderful, simple law, Moore's Law. And it states that the number of transistors on a chip is going to double every 2 years. And that has been true since the 1960s up until today. So this is a transistor. It is a very simple electronic component that sits on a microchip. It's basically a switch between two states, 1 or 0 from a digital processing point of view. And so in our computing, what we do is, you've heard things like 8-bit, 16-bit, 32-bit chips. What they're doing is they're running lines of code, 1s and 0s. And those transistors help us decide, oh, look, that's a 1, that's a 0, and the switching happens, and then thus the processing. So the more transistors you have on a chip, the faster that chip would be, the better it could do tasks, better capabilities. Now, this is the CEO of NVIDIA holding up a GB10 chip in Project Digital, their new $3,000 AI supercomputer that they launched last week, 2 weeks ago, at the CES show in Vegas. Now, this chip has 208 billion transistors on the chip. And let me put that into context for you. So here's the history of Intel and the number of transistors in their chips. So in the 70s, there would have been thousands of transistors on a chip. And in the 80s, there would be hundreds of thousands. In the 90s, there would be millions of transistors on a chip. And into the early 2000s, there was hundreds of millions of transistors on a chip. And more recently, we broke into the billions. In the last kind of, 6-7 years, we had billions of transistors on our chips, up to nearly 20-30 billion more recently. Now, he just held up, talk about Moore's Law doubling down, he held up a chip with 208 billion transistors, which means that it can do processing of 200 billion parameters. And if you network two of them together, it can do 400 billion parameters of code. That is super fast. So what we're about to see is a step jump in terms of processing speeds. And that's not all, by the way, because that's just traditional computing. At the same time, then, you have quantum computing being developed by IBM and by Google. In fact, Google's Project Willow, one of their quantum computing experiments, recently showed its results in December. And they took a mathematical computation, fed it into their quantum computer. And what would have taken a traditional computer 10 septillion years to calculate, and by the way, 10 septillion is 10 to the power 25. It is older than the known universe in terms of numbers of years. It would have taken our traditional computers, even the billion transistor ones, that long to process. It took Project Willow's computer 5 minutes. 5 minutes to do something that would have taken 10 to the power 25 years to do otherwise. That just shows you the unbelievable speed of quantum. And we're stabilizing quantum computing better and better now. And quantum computing, by the way, works by not reading codes of ones and zeros. It actually alters the ones and zeros to be what they need to be as it goes on. It's the principles of quantum computing, changing the state of matter. In fact, there's a link here to a previous article and vlog I did all on quantum if you're interested. But those two things together, the acceleration of traditional computing with our capabilities and the quantum computing coming our way, means that Generation Beta are going to grow up not only in an AI-enabled, humanoid, robotic, fueled world, but they're going to grow up in a world where what we know can be done is going to fundamentally change. I think we've been on a roller coaster for the last 20 years, and we've been on the uphill piece. We've strapped ourselves in, we're terribly excited, we've queued for hours, and we're on that uphill trundle. And that's what the millennial generation and Gen Z and Gen Alpha have been playing with technologically. They've been playing with apps and phones and AR and VR and AI. It's getting really exciting. But we're about to hit that point, that crest. And that crest, that downhill piece that's about to come, that's a hands in the air piece. That's like, here we go. Because what we're about to head into now in society is a capability that we've never dreamt of before. And things like new energy sources, things like space exploration, things like healthcare, growing human organs instead of harvesting them, instead of having huge acres all over the world being cut down and cleared for farming, for cattle and pigs, and we may be growing meat protein in labs. Consequences of chemotherapy, instead of getting general drugs, having a protein sequence piece done on your tumor where at the cellular level we understand each piece and give you drugs particularly just for you. And obviously the capabilities and permutations here of what we will be capable of doing because these processing speeds are coming away is just astounding. And even simple things like automation and autonomous vehicles and humanoid robotics, which you already have. We're going to see that just simply explode now because the processing power that we're about to have is going to make those things, which have been quite good, just unbelievably good. And so Generation Beta are going to grow up in that roller coaster drop. The next 15 years is going to see all of society accelerate in terms of pace, and the opportunities are amazing for human development, for the betterment of humankind, but also for your brand and business. What does it mean? It means that we are, of course, at the cusp of AI. We know that. You've already heard that from so many sources. And if you're watching this now, I think what you need to think about is, okay, well, how can we actually start this in our business and brand? How can we use AI to simply get our processes better, to automate some tasks, but also how can we use it to really change the nature of the customer experience, the employee experience? How can we start to use this? Because ignoring it is like ignoring the internet in the 2000s or ignoring mobile commerce. You just can't do that. It's going to change the nature of everything. The beta babies are going to grow up in an amazing world, as we all are. We're all part of this roller coaster drop. So trust me, hands in the air, scream as loud as you can. Let's get ready for some fun. Until the next time, I'm Ken Hughes.